stay at the table and we'll just keep playing until someone tells us the game's over. But I press you to use your voice to encourage ongoing dialogue to mitigate the dismantling of NAFTA. We need you to talk to your congressmen and women in their hometowns and urge them to work with this administration here to overcome or prevent implementation of what some people have called poison pill proposals. Focus on our history of trade, focus on our shared objectives of growth and prosperity for our people. These are two of the most intertwined economies in the world, and we remain hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for that thoughtful presentation. I do want to say for the record that as the descendant of a St. Catharines, Ontario tavern owner and a Scottish immigrant through Nova Scotia, you're the cousins we always want to see. So, thank you. Next, we have Kevin Dempsey from the American Iron and Steel Institute.
Great, thank you. I've got one slide that hopefully we'll get up here.
We'll get it up there.
But it's great to be here. There are a number of comments made by the previous two speakers that I want to echo, because really for the steel industry, we see the NAFTA as a success, frankly, as an agreement that has brought us together to work as a bloc and to compete with the rest of the world. So to build on some of the points that were made by Governor Blunt and Mr. Darby, I want to emphasize, but when you talk about trade in Washington today, you always want to start with what's the trade balance. And I think we have a remarkably positive story to tell for steel with NAFTA. As a result of NAFTA, we've gone with our trade with Canada and Mexico from a trade deficit back in the early 90s to a strong trade surplus in steel. We actually have a larger trade surplus with Mexico than we do with Canada, but it's actually a relatively balanced and productive trading relationship. And but it's a critical one for us. About 90% of all U.S. steel exports go to Canada, our largest export market, and Mexico, our second largest market. And those exports have gone up tremendously over the last 23 years. Overall, in tonnage terms, steel, people like to talk in tons. We've tripled our exports, but in value terms, in dollar terms, they've actually quadrupled because we've increased the amount of higher value products that we're exporting, in particular in the auto sector, because we're selling a lot more advanced auto related steel products in both Canada and Mexico, and those products are then going, of course, back and forth across the border repeatedly. But it's not just a benefit for the U.S. Canada and Mexico's steel industries have also grown. Our intra-NAFTA trade in steel has more than doubled since the agreement went into effect. And probably more important than just these trade balance numbers, it's strengthened our customers and our supply chains. Because for steel, you can make all the steel in the world you want, but if you don't have a strong auto industry, a strong construction industries, you don't have other strong industries to buy that steel, you're out of business. And so for us, really what's been very critical is that we're building throughout North America an integrated supply chain that NAFTA steel can supply, and it allows us as a group then to compete strongly with our competitors in other parts of the world. I very much like Governor Blunt's model of the three centers of automotive production. I will tell you, for the steel industry, that's the way we think today in terms of our competitiveness. And we have huge competitiveness challenges around the world. As you may know, we have a huge global overcapacity problem in steel, something like 700 million metric tons of steel overcapacity, centered in Asia, but not exclusively there. And that's putting huge pricing pressures on us, huge increases in imports coming into not just the United States, but into Canada and Mexico. You can see our trade surplus has gone down a little bit in recent years. That's not because we're seeing increased import flows from Canada or Mexico. Frankly, it's because our exports are going down. They're going down in Canada, they're going down in Mexico, they're going down in other third markets because of increased competition from government subsidized and dumped steel products from China and other parts of the world that they're challenging us. So we have to work on that problem. And what we have been doing as a result of the NAFTA is that the steel industry has very much been working as a bloc. We worked together. There was an institutional arrangement set up in the early 2000s called the North American Steel Trade Committee. It is a meeting of the 3 NAFTA governments and the 3 NAFTA steel industries twice a year, where we get together and strategize on the key public policy competitiveness challenges we face and say, what can we do together to ensure that we are competitive so that we can compete with folks from around the world. And that's created a very strong partnership. And so when we go internationally to the OECD Steel Committee, or as you may know, in the G20 process, there is now a global forum on steel overcapacity, or even when we're talking at the WTO, we often talk for NAFTA as the NAFTA steel industry, because we have a common interest, a common set of goals to advance, to deal with government subsidies in other parts of the world, to remove trade distortions, to allow us to compete on a level playing field. And so we're speaking with one voice, and that's an outgrowth of the NAFTA, and it's a sign of how I think we would hope we can see that emulated in other sectors, but I think it's a critical component of what has made us stronger, and we hope will continue to make us stronger going forward. Now, as the other two speakers said, while NAFTA's been great for us, we think it can be improved, and so we have a number of similar recommendations we've made as to ways to update NAFTA to make it more successful, to make it a stronger agreement, to increase the incentives to build things in North America to compete with the rest of the world. They cover a number of common areas. Start with one that Dennis just mentioned, improving the movement of goods at the border, legitimate intra-NAFTA trade, improving customs procedures so that we can get those goods across the border quickly and on time with the least amount of difficulty. For the steel industry in the United States, our biggest problem intra-NAFTA is when things get held up, usually unintentionally, at the border. We are selling steel and we are putting that on rail cars or on trucks, and we are sending that down to up to Canada, down to Mexico, and it needs to get there right away because as a general matter, we're supplying goods just in time for those manufacturing facilities. They don't have a lot of room and a lot of interest in having a bunch of steel stockpiled around, so we need to be able to get that in quickly. And where we've had trouble over the last 23 years has usually been, when there's some hiccup somewhere in some port, and suddenly rail cars of steel are sitting on the sidelines. We end up paying demurrage charges to the railroads for that, and our customers don't have the steel they need to make the goods. So improving that cross-border infrastructure is critical. We do think NAFTA can also be used as a model for how to have a truly first-rate trade agreement. And as Governor Blunt said, I think part of that is adding disciplines on currency manipulation. Not so much because we think there's a problem within North America on currency manipulation, but again, if we're going to compete with the rest of the world, we need to set a high bar for what types of standards we need to encourage other countries then to meet those same type of standards so that we can compete on a level playing field. We would also add increased disciplines on state-owned enterprises. That's some work that I think was done in the TPP that was beneficial. That is a major source of competition for the steel industry in North America, are state-owned enterprises in China and other parts of the world, and establishing greater international disciplines in an area where there basically are no disciplines is critical. So adding that to the NAFTA we think would be a very good step forward. Another area just in terms of promoting, again, how we work together to compete would be to increase cooperation and coordination of our trade enforcement and trade remedy regimes. We often face the situation where, as I mentioned, we have dumped product coming into the United States, it's coming into Canada, it's coming into Mexico. If there's more where we can do, we each have our own national laws, but ensure that we're talking amongst each other and making sure we're all coordinating in how we enforce our WTO consistent trade remedy regimes can be, I think, useful to all three industries, and also to deal with circumvention and evasion. One of the biggest problems we face in the trade remedy area is that we get an order on hot-rolled steel or pipe from a particular country, and then suddenly we find that steel is being circumvented through a third country, being mislabeled and coming in. And that's a problem that we face now in the United States, but in Canada and Mexico. And it is one of the areas, frankly, we're already working together. Out of one of the outgrowths in recent years out of the North American Steel Trade Committee is there is now a North American customs dialogue where we are bringing together customs officials from the 3 NAFTA countries to discuss and coordinate amongst themselves how they address these problems of circumvention and evasion. So that's another area where I think there's more work that can be done in a positive way. And finally, rules of origin. I know this has become a very big, important area of debate in the NAFTA negotiations. Again, we think the NAFTA, as it's been written, has been very successful for steel. We are exporting a lot of steel that goes into automotive products. About a third of our exports to Mexico, we estimate, are for automotive production. And so that's been successful. But we do think there are ways to improve the rules of origin, to make the tracing regime for automotive vehicles and their parts a little bit stronger for ensuring that North American steel is fully counted in that operation. So we have some technical proposals that we've submitted to all 3 NAFTA governments on ways to perhaps tweak the tracing regime to make sure that North American steel is being counted in that process. We're not advocating changes in overall, regional value content requirements or setting up new national content requirements. We're trying to work within the system of the existing NAFTA rules of origin regime to see, are there ways to improve it and frankly future-proof the agreement to ensure that the threats that we see from steel coming in from outside of North America are addressed going forward. And I want to emphasize all of these proposals that I've mentioned on how to improve the NAFTA, those are not U.S. industry proposals. Those are all NAFTA steel industry proposals, because one of the things, again, as we see our success, is we worked very hard as an industry to identify areas where all 3 of the NAFTA steel industries would jointly agree that these are ways to improve the agreement and to strengthen it. And so we put together a common set of objectives that we've given to each of our governments, and we're continuing to work with them and hope that we can see some progress there. Finally, I want to end just briefly on the threat if NAFTA ended, if we withdrew from NAFTA. A lot of talk about how where tariffs might go. The U.S. has bound its steel tariffs at 0, as has Canada in the WTO. So if we pull out of NAFTA, the tariff on steel coming in from Mexico goes from 0 today to 0 tomorrow. There will be no change, there will be no additional protection. Mexico, on the other hand, its tariff bindings on steel at the WTO are 35%. Now, they're not imposing a 35% tariff on the rest of the world today. They have about a 15% MFN rate tariff that they apply to countries with whom they do not have free trade agreements. So if we withdrew from the NAFTA, our steel exports would face at least a 15% tariff. But remember, Mexico has free trade agreements with Japan, with the EU, with any number of other countries. So our competitors from those other countries would not be facing that additional tariff. It would put steel producers in the U.S. at a very significant competitive disadvantage, and it would threaten the very good story that I think we have today. So we think it's important to build on the success of NAFTA, strengthen it, and we look forward to working with our colleagues in the auto industry. We think it's a partnership between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Certainly at the industry level, we've been working that way, and we'd like to continue that. And we'll continue to work to see that we can build on the success we've had with NAFTA over the last 23 years. So there, I'll stop at that point. Great. Turn it back to Fred.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So I think all 3 speakers have really helped to highlight something that we recognized very clearly in the Obama administration, which was how important the North American platform is to U.S. competitiveness, and what a critical role, that we're not just talking these countries in a vacuum, but we're talking a big world where the U.S. is only 20% of GDP, or the NAFTA region's 25% of GDP. And frankly, our competitors, as I think you guys have laid out quite effectively, are well organized and intense to compete with. So let me ask you a question following up on this, which is, in talking about the rules of origin, what do you think the likely effect of the proposed rules of origin and U.S. content rules would be? Do you think this would cause manufacturer components to move from the U.S., and what would be the impact on consumer prices?
I think it's on.
Well, I'll start. We think they'd be totally counter to the objectives of the Trump administration. The actual impact of these proposals would be extremely counterproductive. The business decision here is not very difficult. If the cost to comply with the new rule of origin exceeds the tariff rate, then you'll just pay the tariff, and you won't worry as much about where your supply chain is based, because you'd be free to explore all your opportunities on supply chain. So we think the rule of origin proposal as it exists today, which is an extreme proposal. I mean, there is no product built in North America that can meet this current proposal. Would force us to pay the tariff, which, as I said, was a $10 billion cost to industry. But then would also then force us to look elsewhere sometimes in our sourcing decisions. So the winners would be other countries outside of North America. And we're very concerned about the proposal. We're certainly open to exploring how we could respond to different ideas on rule of origin, but the current proposal is just not something that would be workable for North American industry.
Yeah, I think I can echo your. I think for Canada, the worry is, you're right. In a world without NAFTA, where the rules of origin, we can't meet them, then what happens is companies will not invest in Canada right now, and parts will come in from outside in North America, because if it's only a tariff, I guess the policy objective might have been, well, if we do this, people will invest capital in the U.S. and build here. I think the opposite is true. What will happen is it'll become, we'll just search around the world for the cheapest part we can get, and I think that would be detrimental to all three countries.
Yeah, for us, the rules of origin have to work for our customers. We want to see more manufacturing investment in North America. If the rules become too complicated, too complex, either they simply don't use the NAFTA rules. What we would worry about is then the pressure to relocate to other parts of the world where we won't be selling a single ton of steel would go up greatly, and so that would be a negative.
So this is fascinating, hearing from some of the biggest and most important industries in the United States. One of the things that's always important is stakeholder input. And so let me ask this question: did USTR or anyone else in the administration consult you about these impacts before making these proposals? And are you aware of any underlying economic analysis that supports the administration's view and the likely impacts of these proposals?
We were not consulted about the particular proposals, and I'm not aware of any economic analysis on it. So.
Dennis, I'm not going to ask you that question.
I was going to say, yeah. No, they didn't call. They
I
didn't
think
call. They didn't call.
we certainly had discussions with the administration about some of the concepts on rule of origin, and we think made the case as to why the current rule works. We worked to actively debunk some of these myths, for example, that there's lots of Chinese content that somehow is a free ride on NAFTA, and demonstrate that that's just not the case. We spent a lot of time really digging into the data, for example, that tried to argue that there'd been a dramatic decrease. There's a Commerce Department report that stated that there'd been a dramatic decrease in the amount of U.S. content in Mexican vehicles. That really turns out to not be the case at all. And in fact, the U.S. content in Mexican produced vehicles over the course of NAFTA has been very, very steady. We wouldn't challenge the motives of the administration. We certainly believe that they're trying to drive investment in the United States and hopefully in North America. but certainly we believe the proposals they put forward are counterproductive to what I believe are shared goals of the administration, Congress, and certainly industry.
One last question, then we'll turn it over to the audience, which is, one of the issues that's received a lot of discussion is the investor-state dispute resolution. And obviously, Dennis talked about Chapter 19, but looking at ISDS more generally, both in terms of the NAFTA context, but also as we've talked about how important this agreement is as a template for future agreements. I know as part of the TPP negotiations, it was a very high priority for the United States. But if you could just talk a little bit about what you think on the ISDS provisions and why they are important.
So we're a little bit of an outlier in that as an industry, we've really never used ISDS. And actually in our submission, we believe that when you're dealing with developed advanced economies like the Canada and Mexico, it's probably not necessary. Having said that, that's not, it's certainly not one of our priorities, and we don't spend any time really advocating for the elimination or the conservation of ISDS. It's just not a priority for the auto industry, particularly when we have lots of very real concerns about where the negotiations are headed.
I mean, actually, if you go back in history, the original Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, it almost didn't come to fruition because Canada insisted on an independent dispute resolution mechanism built into the agreement, and we've got it that it's in our European trade agreement. So I think, from our point of view, if there are, to your point, Governor, from our point of view, we think it should be preserved, but it doesn't have to be the way it is today. We think that there are ways to modernize it to make it more fair, but we think that, especially when you're a small country like Canada dealing with a very large country like the U.S., having an independent panel to resolve disputes is I think gives reassurance to Canada, the Canadian business and Canadian public that we're going to be treated fairly. So we're not asking for anything special. We're just saying we prefer to have an independent or dispute resolution mechanism in whatever form it takes.
Yeah, I'd just say AISI hasn't developed a specific position on the question of Chapter 11 ISDS, but I do think it's important, however the agreement is updated, that it promote continued cross-border investment within the NAFTA region, because I think that we have a lot of U.S. companies that are building and making investments into Mexico. They have investments into Canada to serve our customers in this integrated supply chain. We need to be able to. We need to encourage that type of investment so that we can ensure the just-in-time delivery. So whatever the details are, it needs to promote that.
If I could just add one comment, I mean, one of the reasons we address ISDS at all, since we've never used it in North America, is that in the TTIP negotiations, we became very concerned that you weren't going to be able to complete TTIP with the existing ISDS framework. So either not having ISDS in TTIP or some pretty significant modification to ISDS was ultimately going to be necessary. And we were very optimistic about TTIP and certainly still hopeful that at some point in the future it can reemerge. Appreciate all your good work on TTIP, Bruce, when you were in the administration.
So what we're going to do, sorry. Just take this one. Yeah, I got it. So what we're going to do, we're running a little long on time, so we're going to do a quick round robin, maybe take 3 quick questions, bring it back to the panel, and then we'll wrap up panel 1 and switch to panel 2. I ask, we like to follow what we call Jeopardy rules here, so please ask your question in the form of a question, and instead of commentary, and if you could identify yourselves quickly. We're going to do 3 quick ones. 1, 2, 3, just go right through.
Yeah, hi. Thank you guys all so much for your comments this morning. My name is Jeff Horowitz. I'm with the U.S. International Trade Commission. And my question, Governor Blunt, you touched on this in your remarks when you said that 22% of the automobile sector is accounted for in NAFTA countries, but when you look at just exports, that's 62%. So if my numbers aren't misleading me, that seems to run counterintuitive to sort of the stated goal of these restrictionist trade policies, that is to lessen the trade deficit. Intuitively, if you decrease something that is more exports than imports, you're not going to be bettering the trade deficit from the U.S. perspective. You're going to be making it worse. So I think my question is just, are the numbers more complicated than that? Or is it simply a matter of people don't want to believe what the numbers actually represent? And to the degree, Kevin or Dennis, if you guys have anything to weigh in on as well, I welcome it. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Megan Casella with Politico Pro, and thanks for sharing. You all shared your priorities of what you'd like to see in a renegotiated NAFTA, but I guess I'd just like you to share your perspective, your take on how things are going so far. With round 5 next week, we're maybe halfway through the renegotiation, so your take on how things are going, and rules of origin in particular, the proposal that's on the table isn't ideal, so any sense of whether that might be adapted, what counter proposals might be coming, that sort of thing. Thanks.
Barbara Bowie Whitman. It seems that the underlying problem behind the U.S. current negotiating position and proposals for renegotiation is a belief on the part of our chief executive that NAFTA was a bad agreement to start with. If each of you had a 2-minute drill to tell that gentleman why NAFTA was a good agreement, you've spelled it out in different ways this morning, but if you had a very, very short time to say, this is why it's good and why we're heading in the wrong direction to try to change some of these things, what would you focus on?
Valerie, we have one more we want to get back.
Hi, Will Malden with the Wall Street Journal. Thanks so much for being here. My question is a little bit similar to Megan Casella's, and I'm wondering, especially from the Canadian side and those of you in contact with, excuse me, the Canadian or Mexican counterparts, how much feeling is there that there is movement at the negotiating table on those sides? The Trump administration has laid down some pretty stark proposals, and I think the question is whether, whether the Trump side on the one hand, but right now the question is whether the Canadian and Mexican side are willing to come to the table and find some compromises in that framework. Thanks.